Have a seat. Hello number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today we are reviewing a trailer for a very interesting movie and something that will be right up my street, or my alley if you will. And it's the trailer for the movie The Uprising. And now the trailer dropped 13 days ago and already accrued 17 million views. As we read in the description, rise or die. Andrew Garfield stars in The Uprising, only in theaters September 11. Watch the trailer now. Andrew Garfield stars as the legendary leader of a ferocious rebellion against the tyranny of King Richard II. Oh goodness gracious, this already. I'll get back to it. As war burns across England, he forms an army of the people to face the king's might in a fight for justice and survival. Okay, so of course we're gonna react to the trailer together, but most importantly I would like to say this. What to expect from this video? I have a lot to say when it comes to the costume department, if you will, and today I'm gonna be wearing real medieval armor, meaning historically accurate replicas of helmets, armor, an arming doublet accurately reproduced based on the paintings by Piero della Francesca in Tuscany, so that I can show you the differences in function, the way it works between Hollywood armor and the real deal. The movie, which is clearly set in the medieval period in England, is based on a real event, which is the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. This is also called the Great Rising, or, interestingly enough, Wat Tyler's Rebellion. So, even though we're not really told just yet, I believe that's who he is meant to be, Wat Tyler. I'm actually quite happy that they chose this topic for a movie, because the Peasants' Revolt is rather significant when it comes to medieval history, because it is the largest popular uprising ever recorded in medieval English history. And of course, on this video, I'm gonna tell you all about it. We'll look at the history, I'll tell you what actually happened based on the information and data available. But another thing that we always do on this channel is to review the way the medieval period has been represented on screen, and unfortunately a lot of the times when it comes to modern Hollywood, you'll see why I'm adding modern there, it's not a very accurate representation of the time, whether it comes to the weapons, the armor, the clothing, and in general, the visual aspects of what it would have been to see medieval England and its towns, rivers, and countryside. It goes without saying that I understand that this is not a documentary, so for those of you who are like, it's not supposed to be historically accurate, blah 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 blah. Two things, you muppets. Number one, this is not necessarily because I want to force cinema to historically represent everything perfectly like it was a documentary, but it's rather a way to learn and have fun, so that perhaps your enjoyment of the movie when you go and watch it could be increased, because, oh, I know what happened, I know who the guy is, I know what the armor would have actually looked like, or how the battle would have happened, what kind of weapons the lowborn or the lower class, the common people actually had access to. Are they going to represent that? Like, it can be fun. Doesn't have to be annoying. I am annoying, and a pedant at that. But there is a fun component when it comes to learning how history actually was, as opposed to how it's represented, or should we say misrepresented on screen. But here's another thing. The way Hollywood represents the medieval period, everything is grey, everything is dull, no colours around, the armour looks awful. It's a new thing. It's a new thing. Because in 1944, for instance, all the way up through the 1950s, medieval movies were actually credible. The way they were represented really, really well. So I mean, there is that. There's that. We get it, it doesn't have to be historically accurate to the level of a documentary, but I mean, when historical accuracy is objectively 50 times better, can we not have both? I'm gonna click around, otherwise the video will get copy claim. Very first shot, this is the protagonist, the leader of the rebellion, and he's supposed to be a medieval farmer. In fact, he tells us, I am no soldier, I am no priest, I'm just a farmer. I like this beginning because at the end of the day, it sort of represents the three estates of medieval society, in the sense that medieval Europe was generally speaking divided into three main groups. The clergy, those who prayed, the nobility, those who fight, and the common people, those who worked. And the vast majority of these common people were indeed peasants or farmers. It's important, however, to underline that being just a farmer doesn't mean that all you know how to do is to plow the land. A lot of these farmers would have been returned soldiers from war, so the line gets a little blurry when we're not talking about mounted nobility or professional men-at-arms. A lot of billmen, spearmen, archers, more on that later, sword and shield infantry were farmers that had to serve the Lord. Alright, next we've got a major shot of what appears to be medieval London. As usual, the grey filter, no colours whatsoever. In fact, look, it's desaturated of colours. This is the exact opposite of what a medieval city would have looked like. It would have been filled with reds and blues and greens and yellows and all sorts of colors all over the place. Given it's still England, so misty, rainy, generally cold, that's all fine and dandy, but just so we're clear. But let's focus on what he's actually saying. The land is broken. What does he mean by that? Since the movie is set in 1381, there are two major events that kind of introduce the main struggle to both the movie and the historical event. First, the Black Death, a catastrophic pandemic that spread all across Europe between 1347 and 1353. And second, taxation. We'll get back on the taxes later. So here we are in the town, and what we see, once again, beige, browns, and blacks are the only colors by which the common people, but in fact not just common people, I see workers here, maybe blacksmiths, tailors, they're all dressed the same. The king is the law, we are told, and we got this beautiful shot of medieval fortification. See, this is where I'm gonna take a little bit of an issue historically with the description box. Do you remember that it seems, at least by the description, that the king, meaning Richard II in this case, is seen as a tyrant. But was he a tyrant? Well, if that's the way they're going for the movie, then they're not really going historical, because the reality is the King Richard II, in fact, during this revolt, ends up actually granting a lot of the wishes that the people want. Richard II will become a tyrant, but that happens later in his life. In fact, many years after these events. But I suppose a medieval king would play the perfect villain in a movie, so there's that. There he is. Okay, so one thing you will notice, a lot to say about this shot already, but one thing you'll notice, he looks quite young, and that is in fact correct. King Richard II at this time was 14 years of age, and he was crowned king in 1377 after the death of his father, King Edward III, at age 10. Now, of course, I'm sure you imagine that a lot of the stuff that happened, a lot of the terrible repercussions which did occur to the people that dared to rebel against the crown were most likely not because of what he decided, but rather because of what his council decided. Parliament decided. Yes, there was a parliament in medieval England, it was a thing. And some of his closest advisors, and in general upper class and people of import. But before we continue, let's look at this set of armor. Okay, the first thing I want to notice is that the armor itself looks kind of anachronistic. It looks cool, but it is anachronistic in the sense that the cuirass, so the breastplate, backplate combination, looks late 16th century rather than 14th century where we are. In the 14th century, mind you, particularly in the later half of the 14th century, plate was a thing. And in fact, more and more plate will get added onto the suits of armor rather than just be wearing mail. As you can see, he is wearing a mail shirt underneath, which is perfect. It's excellent. I like that they did that. The shoulder plates and his arm harnesses look 15th century. In fact, I've got a set of arms that look very similar to these. The arms, if you notice, cut relatively short. We can imagine that his wrist is here. They cut short, and that is historically correct. But the reason why arms cut short is because you need to give space to the gauntlets, which are then going to overlap and protect the upper side. But this is not happening here because he's wearing plastic. I don't know, but this is not a good idea because you've got a gap, and a blade can enter through this gap and wound the king, which you don't really want. Also, a major problem with a lot of medieval movies is the gorget. The gorget, or gorget, however you want to pronounce it, is the plate collar that protects your throat. While I'm not gonna say that it absolutely never happens that the gorget is worn on top of the breastplate, because I know that you will be able to find a one late 16th or 17th century situation combination where it did happen and I wasn't aware of it because I didn't see the museum entry. Fine, I'm not gonna say never, but I will say, generally speaking, a gorget is supposed to be worn underneath the breastplate. The reason for that is that if you wear it underneath the breastplate, if a blade hits the center of mass, as it most likely will, or a spearhead, or the business end of a spear, or an arrowhead, so they are hitting here, and they are diverted upwards, which could happen depending on the origin of impact. What could happen? If the gorget is underneath the breastplate, it's still going to provide protection and nothing going to go through. But if the gorget is over the helmet, it could happen that the blade goes underneath in between the gap that you have now formed between the breastplate and the gorget, effectively rendering it useless because you'll end up having a stab through your throat. Not to mention, this gorget should have been mounted further up because its throat is open. Another thing is that the helmet, which appears to be a mix between an open-faced barbute and a bassinet without a visor, doesn't fit him. I don't have a problem with the fact that he's wearing a helmet without face protection, because in this moment specifically, I don't think the king is engaged in combat, since he is relaxed, riding his horse in front of a church. Maybe there are rebels around, but his knights on the left don't seem to be bothered. And any knight, so not just nobility, the high-mounted nobility, but any knight would have had multiple sets. So they could have helmets, some types of helmets for certain situations like scouting, or maybe just having some protection, but you're not actually charging in that moment, and then they would switch to a different helmet with a fully enclosing system for when you actually go for the charge. So that's not the problem, but the helmet just doesn't fit him. Not only it's kind of out of center, that can happen, but generally when you secure it right, it shouldn't happen unless you're in the midst of like rolling on the freaking ground. And also look at all this space. His entire forehead is completely exposed. This means the helmet is too big for him. The helmet doesn't fit him. Any type of open-faced helmet or the open-faced section underneath the visor as you lift it up should always cover you all the way ever so slightly above your eyebrows. The saddle is also not a medieval saddle. I don't see the protection that you usually get in the front, but we'll see that if we have a outer shot, because you can tell if the saddle is medieval or not by the way they appear. I'll tell you more about that later. Okay. So what we see here, and we have a lot to say about this shot, is basically the crux of the matter. So what you see, a bunch of peasants, a young girl, I guess, there is soldiers from the king, and then you can see there is someone here, an official, sitting, writing something. So most likely what we're looking at right now are royal commissioners. So this is a tax collector. Let's check out a few other frames, and then I'll tell you what the matter was with these new taxation laws that ended up leading to the revolt. The king, he says, pay taxes. You pay taxes. Here is the king. I mean, that's a lovely shot, actually. I really like this shot. I'm not going to just complain for the sake of complaining, but you see interesting image. But this does look really nice, and all sorts of papers. Did they have paper in the Middle Ages? Yes. The paper was introduced in the medieval period through Arab commerce, and they themselves most likely got it from the Chinese, who invented it many centuries in the past. But in general, in the Middle Ages, you have access to papyri, you have access to scrolls, the difference being a papyrus is a writing medium that is vegetably made. It's a plant, whereas a scroll is created through the skin of animals, and so it's very expensive and durable. A lot of manuscripts are scrolls. Interestingly enough, paper, however, was a cheap alternative, and it was used for things such as, for instance, tax information, which was generally speaking accumulated at churches, because the peasants already had to pay taxes to the church on top of the taxes to the government itself. With the church, it would be the tithe, a tenth of your income. At least they put the belt in the correct section, because medieval people wore the belt at the waist rather than where we put ours at the jeans. A bit like they did in the 1960s, if you will. Okay. All right, so he flips the table. Flippa the table. Because, of course, the people have had enough. And I think that the scene does represent, he starts screaming. That's enough, he says. Goodness gracious, everyone is in brown. Do they all want to become Franciscan monks? We have given you enough. Okay, this is a good scene, though. The actor is doing a really good job, because it does represent the kind of exasperation that the people at this time would have been feeling towards the royal authorities. 100%. They were trying to squeeze them out of everything they had. That is accurate. You shouldn't have done that, farmer. I actually kind of like that he calls him a farmer. This is, at the end of the day, a major confrontation between the highborn and the lowborn, and the idea is that it didn't start here. Remember this is the straw that broke the camel's back. The upper class in general had been trying to keep people that belonged to the common folk down for years, for decades in fact. For instance, look at the sumptuary laws, which were laws that regulated what people were allowed to wear, eat, buy, or display according to the social rank, occupation, income, or legal status. And in England specifically, the nobility was very concerned about clothing. Government tried to even restrict expensive fabric. Why? Well, because after the death, the Black Death, wages went up for some time, at least until the labor laws that tried to regulate them and make them go down again, because there were less people. A lot of people died. We're talking like almost half the population died, which means the workforce had been dismembered. And so now that you need more abled bodies, people want to be paid more, and you need them. So if some, and oftentimes we imagine medieval peasants are being poor, and yeah, the majority were, but generally speaking, that would be the serfs. There were also quite a few mid-tier freemen, so they're not serfs, they're not tied to the land like regular peasants would be, and these would generally be making more money, particularly if they had successful harvest. And then you have among these a small percentage of actually very successful, wealthy peasants that then could afford the kind of clothing that the upper class could, and they weren't going to have that. Okay, hit the man in front of everyone, make an example of him is probably what they're going to go for. I freaking hate that male coifs, this is what these are male coif. The real ones would have to be fitted to the chin, because the ones that we see here, which is basically the same kind of coifs that you would see at a LARP event, not that there is anything wrong with LARPing, it's fantasy, but I'm saying in a real historical situation, a lot of these male coifs that leave the throat completely exposed would not be considered apt for war. Nor for policing, if you will, or law enforcement in the medieval perspective, because they're not protecting. I mean, sometimes you have the ones that can be closed this way, and if you're relaxed, you can open it up a little bit. That's not bad, but this is kind of a design flaw. You don't seem to be able to tighten it and lift it up if needed, which is the main problem. And so he fights back. This did happen. I wonder if this is supposed to be Wat Tyler, the one who identifies himself to the royal authorities as the leader of the rebellion at Blackheath in front of tens of thousands of people, to the king, or if perhaps this is the Brentwood incident, Brentwood being a town in Essex, where instead Thomas Baker begins a protest against the tax collector, who at the time was Thomas Bampton, both Thomases. I still think this is Tyler, though. And boom, Muppets. See, that's what happens when the coif doesn't fit. Like looking through that. Okay, there's a guard with a breastplate in the background. All right, so what we saw happen here is that the guard was about to draw their sword, but he anticipated by stabbing them with what appears to be some kind of sickle. Here's the thing when it comes to the sickle, guys. I need to tell you about the sickle. If we look at the original poster, we see that indeed the sickle, which he's wearing right here on his belt, and so he's not wearing it Assassin's Creed style, I know it looks like it, it's here on the belt, seems to be his weapon of choice. Now, let's make this one 100% clear, just for those who are interested. Would a peasants' rebel army be utilizing all sorts of farming tools and repurpose them as weapons? Absolutely. You can use a scythe, and we know they did. Even repurposing some of the blades, you can use a sickle and hit someone in the head with it. But we have to be very careful, because at the end of the day, the peasants' revolt is a little bit of a misnomer, because a lot of these men, as I say, were former soldiers. Every single one would own a dagger. The majority of the population would own daggers and knives, so you would have seen those all over the place rather than sickles and rastrels at this point. But most importantly, any able-bodied man from England at this time would be trained in archery. These are all archers. So when we look at battles like the Battle of Azincourt or Agincourt, the Battle of Crécy, and we see, oh yeah, the English are deploying longbowmen, yeah, that's the same people. So we need to see bows and arrows and longbows. That is because in medieval England, laws required able-bodied men to own a longbow and practice archery regularly on Sundays and holidays. We have the Assize of Arms of 1252, which ordered all men aged 15 to 60 of a certain wealth to own a bow and arrow and learn how to use them. More appropriately for this period, the Archery Law of 1363, which commanded instead all Englishmen to practice longbow archery on Sundays and holidays at local villages in specifically designed target areas. Then on top of that, the Crown banned other games on Sundays. Football, handball, dice, all banned. Why? Because they wanted people to keep practicing that archery. Then there is the Labour and Mandates of 1388, but it would be beyond the spectrum of this movie. So why did they do it? Well, national defense. In other words, it was a way by which medieval authorities would maintain a ready force of skilled longbowmen for wars, whether it be offensive or defensive, without the high cost of permanent standing armies. But it was also because at the end of the day, England mostly fielded archers. Now, if you compare that to other countries such as Czechia or the Kingdom of Bohemia, Italy, these are crossbow countries, and you can train a crossbowman in 2 to 4 weeks. But a longbowman, you need years of practice. Also because you need to develop the kind of muscles needed to operate heavy poundage, war bows, not to mention accuracy, which was the main characteristic of medieval archery. If you really think about it, a longbowman in the medieval period, in my opinion, should be seen, rather than that as the machine gun of the period, as the snipers of the period. Given they did throw as many arrows as possible onto the enemy throughout the extent of a medieval battle usually, so strength in numbers, but also precision were expected. I mean, a medieval archer could snipe you in the face if you lifted your visor to breathe from distances that you wouldn't even believe it. And this has happened historically, even to a royal prince. So we shouldn't see them armed with extremely elaborate, expensive swords. This is not a standing army, but they shouldn't just have sickles, and in fact him himself shouldn't use that. I mean, the moment you take out this guard, you can take their sword. And that is 10 times the weapon. Okay. So they set the world on fire, the bonfire, very nice. Boom. See, for example, I see why is this man using this? Why is he not using a knife? That would be a good question rather than this. Whatever this is. Nice inside shot of what appears to be the castle here. I love the multi-buttoned doublet that this man is, a nobleman I imagine, is wearing. And, okay, so the battles are gonna look epic, I'm gonna give him that. That is a lot. I imagine this is CGI, obviously, but it kind of looks awesome. It's a little bit of a Robin Hood looking shot. Rebellion, which did happen. I mean, they took out quite a few people of importance and sacked the Tower of London, for instance, so they did cause trouble. The thing is that, as I was saying, the king will grant a lot of their demands, but it's his counselors that said, no, undo it, and we're going to arrest them if they try and live like free men, because that was the idea. People didn't want to be serfs anymore. So what is a serf? You see, a medieval peasant wasn't a slave. If you look at actual slaves, a characteristic of a slave is that he's owned, right, by their lord, which means they can be sold to someone else, given to someone else, but that's not the case. If you're a medieval peasant, first and foremost, usually you're not forced, but you're given the possibility to freely enter into a contract with a lord, which a lot of people did because they needed the work. Problem is that once you sign the contract by your own decision, you can't exit it anymore. Now you're tied to the land, and so is your family. And of course, if the lord happens to sell the land, then you are sold with it to someone else, a different lord. Serfdom wasn't slavery, but they weren't free either. So they're free to enter it, but not to exit it. It's kind of a complicated situation. And people were sick of it. Also because, once again, there was a disproportionate distance between the type of wealth you had in the upper class and the suffering and struggling of the lower classes. This September, I'm definitely going to watch it. Once we draw blood, we opens the gates of hell. That is actually correct, a correct statement. You see, one problem with rebel armies is that they do really well in this kind of guerrilla tactics, cause havoc, destroy things, attack a monastery, which they did, attack a tower because, I mean, maybe they didn't expect it, the people there, and so they couldn't defend themselves effectively against such a large number of bodies. And do remember, the farmers are strong. Farmers are strong. And the reason why there were so many is because at this time, there was a major difference between the population, or the number of people living in the countryside as opposed to urban centers. There were a lot of people living in the rustic areas. But one of the major problems of these kind of rebel armies is that they do not do well in open field combat. And in fact, they get annihilated by the royal armies once they actually face them in hand-to-hand combat. And this is something that happened also between rebellious armies. For instance, the Boudica rebellion during the Roman Empire, they did really well when they attacked them by surprise, when they caused havoc and damage when they weren't expecting it. But as they grow overconfident because of the sporadic victories, sometimes multiple victories, then they end up facing regular armies in direct combat on an open field, and they get massacred. Of course, there are individual reasons. Sometimes it's lack of training. Sometimes they are trained, but they're not well coordinated. But most of the times what happens is that they're not as well equipped. For instance, how much ammunition do you have? And in the case of archery, how many arrows do you have? Because, I mean, you can have the best archers in the world, but if you run out of arrows, you have to imagine that hundreds of thousands of arrows are usually supplied to the king's army, for instance. Not to mention the overall lack of armor, which is another problem with rebel armies of this type. They're not all as well equipped. Bit of a glass cannon, if you will, from a gaming perspective. Okay, there is a... Oh, goodness gracious. All right. So, a few things to see here. So, in the previous shot, we see a knight coming on his way and sheathing his sword. And there we go. This looks like something recycled directly from Braveheart. I don't know why they have this fixation. I mean, they do look cool, I'll give them that. A fixation with these, like, little squared types of armor. There is something sort of looking like that in Japanese armor of the feudal period. But in medieval England, or in general medieval Europe, not really. You have lamella, you have scale, but these very nicely sewn together plates, squares, if you will, rectangles, with all of this space in between that any blade would end up reaching into. Even if you hit square center, it's going to be deflected into the gap. Not great. Looks cool though. And then another thing, of course, this looks rubbery. I wish that they used actual metal, and no mail worn underneath the plate, which is very strange from a 14th century standing army, because these are the king's men. All right, so we have royal archers. That's really cool to see. I don't particularly like it when you can see that these have the handles, the bows, because it makes it look like Victorian target practice rather than medieval war bows. Also, these bows should be laminated, which perhaps they are. I mean, this one does look like it's got two different colors. That's because it's lamination of two different types of wood, and this one too. So, okay, I'll give them that. They look like believable longbows. So the king's army's got archers. Great. This is the face you make when the royal archers shoot at you, I suppose. Yeah, you see, it's basically just farming tools. That's all they seem to be carrying. Instead, we should see a lot of bows. But maybe we will see bows towards the end. Let's see. Cinematic shots. This guy's telling him you're a muppet. More combat. I mean, it's going to be fun to watch, I'm going to be honest with you. I will enjoy watching this. Oh, good. We got a night charge. Let's be careful. All right, let's have a look at this night charge. Here's another thing that happens often in medieval movies, and I never understood why. Knights, cavalry charging with swords in the Middle Ages. Like, what's going on? What happened with the lance? The lance. They should be wearing lances. And then after the impact, the lances break. If they do break, kind of depends, because jousting lances break more easily. It can happen that a war lance breaks, but it's usually a lot sturdier than that. But even if they do, if the lances don't break, then they can run around, reform, recharge, run around, reform, recharge, and just keep doing that, keep pounding them. But if the lance does break, then use your sword, you know what I mean? Or go back and get another lance from your retinue. It kind of depends. It kind of depends on situational, I suppose. But in this case, it looks like the charge is with swords. Also, what's going on? Is this guy a low level? Like, why is this guy just wearing mail, which already... Oh gosh, plus the looks of the color of the mail, it's basically galvanized steel. Maybe it's steel, maybe it's aluminium, in fact. But it's galvanized, you can tell, which basically makes it look like a modern light street post. It's a light post. That's what it is. Obviously, medieval mail wasn't galvanized because we didn't have the technology to do that, which makes it rust-proof. Excellent for LARP, I guess, so you don't have to oil it. Although then again, if you use the mail, it kind of self-cleans. But if you leave it in a spot for a month, it will rust. Here's the thing. This looks terrible. Like, the mail looks terrible. This guy does not look like he's well equipped for combat, particularly when right next to these guys. Although, once again, the type of helmets that they're wearing and the armor, it looks 16th century to me, and not even a great replica of that. Burning everything. Now he's upset. Now he's a ninja. And here, what weapon was that? Because he's stabbing someone through mail, which, I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's extremely difficult if it's good riveted mail. I wonder if it's a sickle again. Probably. That's a beautiful shot of a cathedral, though. Oh, good. Okay, so we do have some archery. I appreciate that. I mean, they should have much better bows than this. Once again, it looks like a low poundage bow. And, I mean, every Englishman knew how to use, able-bodied Englishman knew how to use a war bow, like a long bow, similar to the ones, I mean, Mary Rose bows are later bows, but still, armor looks a little questionable here. I don't know what it is also with modern Hollywood, and they just freaking love 16th century gorget. This is maybe 17th century, to be honest, by the looks of it. Once again, one thing they hate is lances. Don't even dare give me a lance. And yes, as I thought, he always uses the sickle. This is so stupid. Oh gosh, just give him. Bro, after the first victory, this guy should have a sword, a shield, and put on some armor, in fact, if he can. Because here's the thing. We saw him stab to death a guy in mail. So why don't you take his mail? Well, you might think, well, it didn't work because you stabbed through it. It basically was butter, and I get that. But still, think about it. Why not getting a helmet? Once he murders this guy, which he's clearly going to do, he's going to slit his throat, right? take the helmet, put it on your head. Like, I get it, maybe not the right size, okay, but this is probably, after the first battle, you will find something that fits you. And regardless, even if it's not exactly perfect in this scenario, because you're not a professional knight, and you don't have everything perfectly fitted to you, it would still be preferable over risking your skull. Wouldn't it? That's how the protection is supposed to be. Alright, let's begin with something that is a 14th century type of helmet, so it's kind of similar to what we would have seen on the battlefields and in fact the joust tournament and tourneys of this period. And this is a great helm. This one is specifically based on the Pembridge helmet. Let's wear it. Very iconic. Now, quite a lot of things to say, very good protection, but one of the problems with these kind of helmets, if at any point I want to take it off, I need to breathe, I need to drink, or I want to look around, I need to take it off, which is why visored helmets, for example the one I'm going to wear after this, so stay tuned, it's going to be fun, are the next technological step. But in this period, some knights were still wearing these, and they're still good protection, and they are supposed to be worn on top of another helmet, which is called a secret helmet, iron cap. Kind of a low profile helmet that would give you further protection and would connect with this helmet as it suspends over your head. Suspended. The eye slits, called ocularia, tend to be thin on real examples, whereas in movies and video games they tend to be really large. Not a great idea because an arrow can go through. If you notice that there's a lot of perforation, these are for breathing, but believe it or not, they actually help with the overall ventilation so that I get a little cooler and I can see through them. Not a lot, but if this was solid plate, then I wouldn't see anything down. I do have a helmet that has that problem, but as always with armor, it's a matter of compromise. Increased protection, decreased mobility and vision, and vice versa. So there isn't a perfect setup. There is personal preference and pros and cons. Let's wear something a bit more modern. Let's go to the 15th century now. This is one of my favorites. It's a more of a tourney helmet, if you will. Not necessarily the whole profile, but the visor configuration. I wouldn't really want to wear this visor for war, but all you would need to do is switch the visor. So how does it work? Well, there is a button on the side. You push it and it allows you to open the helmet. This way you get to see the inside, which as you can see is fully padded for comfort and impact protection as well. Let's wear it. For the king. So due to the fact that this is a visored helmet, as you can see, I can open it, breathe, drink something, maybe talk to someone. But if the Muppets are coming, oh, there is an archer, enemy crossbowman, getting ready for the charge, then I can lower the visor again. Man, the difference when it comes to the freshness when you open it is insane. Also, you will notice that my voice sounds a little padded now because, I mean, there is padding right in front of my mouth. What type of helmet is this? A close helm, although technically it's actually in between a sallet and an armet. In fact, to be specific, this is called a transitional sallet because the overall shape is that of a sallet, late 15th century, although it borrows a lot of elements from armets and close helms. Some people are actually very peculiar when it comes to the terminology. It's only an armet if it opens like this, and it's a close helm if it opens like this. So in theory, this is a close helm, but people in the Middle Ages called everything an armet anyways, so it's not a big deal. When I say everything, I mean these shape of closed helmets, regardless of the closing mechanism. I'll show you one of those armet-like lateral closing mechanism in a second, so keep watching. Let's lower the visor. So as you can see, very easy, it clicks in and it's now secured, and there is another button that you need to push in order to let it loose again. Now, not all visors worked like this, and some in fact had extra measurements in order to make it even harder for the enemy to open it, but this one, if someone tried to open it, it wouldn't. They would have to remember that there is a button that needs to be pushed, and if they are using a weapon, it's gonna make it difficult to do. So it's a very good type of protection. I personally love this helmet, and notice how it comes already with protection for the throat. This wouldn't be the only type of protection I had for the throat though, because underneath I will be wearing a male standard collar made of mail, so that I get double layer protection. Never mind the movies where they get zero protection for the throat. Medieval knights, give me double. Let's try another helmet on. Alright, this is an armet. As you can see, it opens laterally, so let's close it. It's in the Maximilian style, which is a type of German late 15th century and then 16th century type of style. If you can see, it's got all sorts of ridges that are supposed to increase the structural integrity, but it's also for aesthetic reasons. In fact, you find these all over an armor in the Maximilian style, exception for the protection for the shin or greaves. Let's lower the visor. I told you it was going to be Dark Souls, or Demon Souls actually, well, both of them. Check this out. Oh my gosh. And then they tell me, why do you want them historically accurate? Seriously. What are you even talking about? This is awesome. Of course, this is a bit of a mismatch, this style with this. As I said, this is a German Maximilian style of armor. This breastplate is white Italian armor. But hey, sometimes exports existed, armor made in Italy for the German market, kind of having mix and matches. So, who cares? And now, are you ready for the frog mouth? The final boss of helmets. In fact, the boss in a lot of different video games, that is. I mean, Sentinels, anyone? Forget Dark Souls. The frog mouth. Let's wear it. Man, I haven't worn one of these in a while. Look at this beast. The most dehumanizing one, if you think about it. Because even though this is the eye slit, it looks like the mouth, and so it gives the impression that I have an elongated neck, doesn't it? Of all the helmets that we saw today, this is the one that would give the best protection, but at a cost. These were very popular during the Joust of Peace, so tournament combat, because, I mean, at the end of the day, it's not like you have problems with adversaries and enemies coming to you on the sides. You just needed to look straight, which is one of the reasons why these sometimes are worn bolted onto the breastplate, so you literally could not turn your head, which is one of the reasons why sometimes knights kind of move their heads together with the body, a bit like birds, if you will. But you don't have to wear it that way. In fact, I want to debunk a myth very quickly. While these were very popular during the joust, the tournament, they're not exclusive for the tournament. And we see sometimes some models that are not necessarily optimized for the joust, but are still frog mouths used in direct war combat. But when you wear them for the joust, as I say, you wear them bolted, strapped, blocked. When you wear them in war, you would suspend them a little bit, leave a little gap in between and not bolt them, so that when you do that, you can actually turn a bit more. Why would someone want to wear something like this in war? Because they want to go home and they want maximum protection. Not the most common. In iconography, visored helmets are generally speaking the best option in my opinion, but there were some knights that went for something like this. Alright, now that you've seen all the helmets, what's your favorite? Let me know in the comments. Here is something a lot simpler. This is a kettle hat. Once again, it's a 15th century example, but something similar to this would have happened also in the 14th century. It's just in the 14th century, they tend to look more like actual hats of iron, while this one is starting to get the shape of what will be called a sallet. This is a much lighter type of protection. So, of course, I can do it up. It's a little small for my head, by the way. Would have been a little larger. Fully padded inside. I'll show you the inside in a minute. But when would you wear something like this? At camp, maybe around town if needed, particularly if you're a guard. Scouting mission rather than direct charge. I definitely wouldn't wear it for a charge, but some people did. So I guess it's personal preference. We do find these used in iconography in situations where I personally wouldn't have. Anyways, I am gonna watch this and enjoy it. I can tell you that much. I know I'm nitpicking a lot, and it's only because I love this stuff. You know, that's the reason why I've been nitpicking. Thank you for watching. If you appreciate my content so far and wish to help ensure my ability to continue to tell it how it is, regardless of any possible backlash, please support this channel on Patreon. Any support helps me and my team of academics keep the channel strong and gives us the means to fight back against the political rewriting of history. Stand with us, form the wall, defend the truth.